Emilia from Women in Games in Finland, and we're going to basically start talking about the secrets of community management and customer service. So really doubling down on this whole area around, loving the user, loving the player. Emilia, great to see you, and thank you for stepping in. I know we got you to come in relatively late notice, so really appreciate you being here. I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Emilia Machuca. I was just decided to yesterday that I was able to fill in on a short notice, so cut me some slack. I'm the co-founder and vice president of Women in Games Finland, and I work at Pocket Hunt. It's a recruiting app for games people. So I don't directly interact anymore on a daily basis with gamers, but I've been doing for community management for the past 5 years. So I've gotten a lot of experience. I'm gonna share you my presentation, just a sec. I'm hoping you can see it.
It's just coming through now. Ooh, it's not quite come through yet. Not too sure why.
Paused.
Yes.
Just
interesting.
Can you see it now?
That's it. Perfect. Got it.
Great. Yes. So I have a few topics that I wanted to touch down on and talk you a bit more about these. Since community management sometimes, in my experience, is undervalued in a sense that sometimes I need to explain not just what I do, but why the whole concept of community management and why it's needed, why it exists. But yeah, I'm going to talk about 4 things today. About that community management is all about listening, and why transparency is so important. And then some of the mistakes you should avoid, since all of us are anyway, one day you will all make mistakes, we all do. I've made mistakes, not a big one yet, but let's see when that day comes. Then the value for the company, for the game studio, that's not always so clear in everyone's mind. And then, since we're dealing with gamers and we all know what type of community that is on the internet, I'm going to talk about how to keep your community and your agents safe. But yeah, let's dive in. So for the listening and transparency, you should never forget that you can't have a community without trust. And when you have that, you can build on it, and then it will also give you free hands, and it will also give you a lot of power towards the users. And something I would like to, so you should always tell them what's going on and what's coming, but you should never reveal dates, because we all know that something will happen, something will probably go wrong. And in my experience, the benefits of the hype will never balance the crash. So even though you manage to build a lot of hype, that you say there's this huge update coming next week on Tuesday, and then something happens, you have the coronavirus and you can't do it on Tuesday, the players will not accept it, and it will be hard for you to explain, even though it makes sense. But since it doesn't really matter if it makes any sense. So that's why you need to have a balance between being open, but not revealing too much. And then something I've talked with colleagues, some of us have an imaginary friend, like when we have player support, I might say that even though I'm doing both, I might say that my colleague here, John or Eve, she will, from player support, she will take care of it. Because it's sometimes easier for the user when they see that this is being taken seriously, like for two people are actually handling it, even though that's not the case. But this is just from my personal experience that this is working. You could try this. Maybe it will work for you too, or it won't, but at least make sure that the tone of voice is coherent when you have two personalities. Then something about your trustworthiness. When you choose your nickname or the player handle, be coherent also, and make sure that I make mine to be sort of personal, but so that they don't reveal that much about myself. I use them based on my name, but I twist them around so that you might know it's me, but you might not know that it's actually me who's behind it. But anyway, you have to be your authentic self when you do this, because they will sniff you if you're faking it. They will always know, and then you've lost their trust. And then another thing, my background is in communications and in crisis communications. And as you know, everyone has always taken a screenshot. So beware and don't delete stuff, because someone will always be able to prove that you did that once. So beware of screenshots. Then more about the mistakes. I sort of touched upon them already. But since gamers can be one of the most toxic, the best community and the worst community online, I would say do not be too harsh at first on a user whose behavior is toxic, because you might not know what's going on. Are they trolling you? And then it's harder for you to help them to solve the crisis if you, not that you need to take in any crap, I mean, that's different, but don't lower yourself on their level. That's a battle you will never win. And it's your job to be the adult here. And when you have built your community based on trust, and they trust you and you've been open, at some point, your community members will start to take care of this for you. So if someone behaves badly, they will shut them down, they will report them, and it will make your job so much easier. And also you should remember to thank them, because they did your job for you. And then if something passes you by that you didn't notice, or you didn't hear about it, or you weren't aware, because you need to listen, and you need to listen when it's going on, like right away. Because if the moment passes already, you might have lost your touch, and then it's harder for you to solve what already went wrong. So you have to be, you don't have to be present all the time, but you need to know what's going on. And next, I'm going to talk a bit about the value for the company, and why. Well, this is something I'm very passionate about, of course, since this is my job. But sometimes it's hard to show, especially for investors, if they only care about the numbers, that how do you make your job as important in their eyes as another team member that you have. But if you start community management when the game already has a community and it has a life of its own, then it's too late. Then you can't manage it anymore. And you're sort of an outsider, even though the community is yours. So you should do this from day one. And then the social features and communities impact the retention in a way that is sometimes very hard to measure. But it doesn't mean that it would be less important. You need to find a way to measure this. You can have all of these amazing analytics tools, and maybe this way it would be easier for you to make your job valued more if there's a problem in the team that they don't value because your numbers are harder to understand. And then there's also the other side, that it's free marketing for you. The social sharing, especially in games, but in other apps also, its importance grows every year a lot. And you should never lose touch of that, because it's then all of your great work, it's all for nothing if no one knows about your game. And if your gamers don't talk about your game to other players, then it's only your marketing that they hear from it. And is it a good game then, if it doesn't have this sort of inner hype? And also, in my view, more and more people also play for a sense of belonging. They're looking for communities. They're looking for people that they have something in common. It might be just this one game that they have in common, but they might still find people that they want to talk to and they want to play together. So, and I think that's pretty amazing. And also, there are a lot of big game companies here that have had success stories with new features in their games, and the ideas came from the community and the players, and they have this huge, this huge resource that you should never undervalue. And when they care about your game, they want you to help develop it further, and that's pretty cool. And then for the other side of the communities, this is super important, and the whole team and the leadership needs to acknowledge the importance, and they need to support community managers and people who work in player support. Because sometimes the amount of stuff that we have to listen to is overwhelming. And sometimes it's, when on its worst days, it can be dangerous. And so that's what, this might be serious business. So do not take this lightly. And your team should always understand why you do this and why it's equally important as any other roles on your game team. And then some practical tips. Always make sure that your personal information cannot be found online if you don't want it to be. And a friend of mine who's a community manager in a game company here, she had this case that her mother tagged her in a picture on Facebook, and some of the toxic players found her that way. So that was less than fun. So make sure that before you start this, all of your profiles are as locked as you can have them, just to be on the safe side. And then, since my background is in crisis communications, you need to have the processes ready before you launch in case something goes wrong. Because and as you know, all of these, they always happen during a weekend or on holiday, or you're somewhere on a boat and then everything blows up, and if you don't have a plan, fixing it will not be easy. And then share your experiences with other community managers. There are a lot of cool ways that you can do this. We have here in Finland, we have you have Facebook groups and informal gatherings and formal gatherings, and we share experiences and tips because we're all in this together, and we all want to help our players, and we all want to promote our cool games and this amazing industry where we all work in. Yeah, I guess that's all of what I wanted to say, and then I guess I'm on time, right?
Yeah. So yeah, you're doing perfectly fine, and yeah, and obviously I want to hopefully invite other people to ask questions. I will myself, yeah. So there's there's so much stuff you could unpack over some of this stuff. I think particularly for me is the protecting your community team. I think that's something that people often forget. I mean, I remember being involved in the very early days back in '98, would you believe? We had a team, and we had to set up a process, for example, to deal with, risks of grooming and, adult material, whatever it might be. Because in the UK, I think it is the same in lots of places, possession of inappropriate material is itself a criminal offence. So if you had a machine which had the offensive material on it, if there was such a thing, that somebody shared, that person is responsible. So we had to set up an arrangement with the Metropolitan Police Authority in order to know what was the way our team could deal with situations like that. As it happened, it never happened, thank goodness. But if we hadn't thought about it and there was an incident, I don't want my community manager going to jail for something they weren't responsible for.
Exactly.
And do you think people understand how important this is? Just genuinely, profoundly important some of this stuff is.
No, they don't. To be honest, they don't.
So how do we educate them? There's a hearty sigh. That's a hearty sigh you get.
Sharing the experiences and telling examples. I mean, I've heard so many horror stories. Of course, people only tell you the horror stories because otherwise it's not news. And
exactly.
But also, every horror story is too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's so many. Obviously, there's issues about kind of. There are very negative areas we can go into, and I think even just the experience of dealing with the toxicity of some communities can be quite profoundly damaging to people's mental health. And I think even the day-to-day grind of seeing arguments and messages that happen between people on a normal everyday basis can be quite debilitating if you're not looking after that team, I think. Yeah, I think it's a really tricky thing to get right as well. And I think maybe it's to do with some things that Tabor was saying, Thinking Ape. It's empowering people to feel like what their actions and what they do is meaningful, and empowering them to make decisions. I think is part of the solution as anything.
And they need to be a part of the leadership and the decision-making process, because they're your front line.
Exactly.
On good days and on bad days.
Well, exactly. And giving people that awareness that because we've got an interesting most of the time we're painting a black picture at the moment. Most of the time, I think being part of a games community is a thoroughly delightful, wonderful experience.
Yes.
Yeah, and having great community managers who love the game and who appreciate love the audience too, and appreciate the value that the audience are getting from that game. I think that's an incredibly rewarding thing for many people. The issue, I suppose, is how do you make sure you
do it? I mean, you can't do this if you don't love the game and if you don't love your players. Otherwise, this is not the job for you.
No, exactly. So we have a question here again from the very prolific anonymous, who's saying regarding the message along the lines of, even when you reasonably explain unfortunate events to players, they still won't accept it.
Yes.
Is the ability to reason to players, to take things away, to break bad news, etc., getting easier, or is it getting harder over the long run?
Harder. Harder. I would like to be positive here, but I guess
Don't tell me this.
but to be honest, I think it's harder, and the more you have features and the bigger the game gets, the more invested in the game your players are.
Yeah.
But then again, you don't want them to be not invested. I mean, if they don't care, then there's something wrong with your game.
Exactly. But I think it's again, it's a bit similar to what we just said about making sure that, you know, the communities feel like their roles are meaningful and that they have the ability to. It feels to me like, you know, the more that we engage and reach out and explain ourselves in a positive way, or at least engage the audience in our decisions, and I think, you know, by setting boundaries that say, look, actually, it's still the game we're making, and we have our own vision for this game, but we're listening and we're appreciating what you want, and we're using data to check that. So I think that to me, that's really critical. We had an issue with back in the PlayStation Home days. We had a real issue because there were some features that were promised back in 2007. We launched in 2008, and we never had them live by 2011 because they were impractical. They were stupid.
Yes.
They weren't stupid, but that's not fair. It was more that we could only have done them if Sony had said they were going to enforce certain things with developers, which they didn't. So it was a difficult problem because we couldn't deliver these things. And we got such grief in the press and in the community. It continues.
Oh, yes. And it's not just the players, it's the community also in the industry and the media.
Exactly. That whole range of audiences. And I think the only thing that really helped us is just being consistent and saying, you know, we're doing what we can do. This is what we're going to do. We're not going to be able to do that right now. And just try to explain. And
you have to be honest.
Yeah.
They will know immediately when you're not telling everything, or they will know, especially if you lie. They will always know.
Exactly. You never recover from that.
Yes, exactly. and the trust is gone. You can't fix that.
So, I mean, to me, that basically says, well, you know, what we're saying is that the community management team are essentially the interface between us and the players. So they're basically our voice piece. And if we don't give them the power, the management, the tools to do that in an honest and engaging and passionate way, it's as bad as if we screw up the design of the game, arguably.
Yeah, it is. And I think the reality is that community managers don't have enough executive power as they should have.
Yes.
In a way,
and I actually think that you should be putting...
Because they tell you without them you will not know if the features you have in the game, do they actually work? Is the UX working or not?
No, exactly. I totally agree. And actually, should we not be putting them at the heart of the decision-making process? I mean, honestly, I think, I genuinely think that we haven't got our community management team in the middle going, what was that? Hang on, no, that's not what they want. They want this. And now, it doesn't mean that we have to do everything the community say, I don't think.
Oh, of course not. I mean, they are... they are... but as long as they are passionate, you should listen to them. Then it's a different thing if you want to act up on it, or you just want to leave as it is.
Yeah.
But you should always hear what they have in mind, because then it's a resource that you might lose, even though, especially if the idea that they have is a bad one.
Yeah. And I think if you communicate why it doesn't work, then generally they'll understand it, even if they don't agree.
It's not feasible. You have to explain why it's not feasible.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I found really interesting, over the various years is being able to say that's a lovely idea, but often it's not an idea that has any commercial sense to it, and often it would actually compromise gameplay. Because I think it's very rare that you have players who absolutely understand game design. I mean, everybody thinks they can make design games. I think that's fine.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. It's like it's one of my biggest bugbears. But actually understanding the implications of a design, I think, is something which takes it takes skill, takes experience, takes insight, takes a certain type of brain, I think. So have you had situations like that where you've had to sort of like steer audiences to help them understand why we're making different decisions than they want?
Some of the decisions that you will make are going to be unpopular ones. And that's where I think your professionalism needs to kick in. That the way you communicate this, that the message is clear and you keep it coherent, and you take the energy to explain it time and time and again, because they will keep asking, and then you just have to explain to them again why this didn't work or why we decided to go do it like this. And often it's the small minority that is making the noise. That's why you need to stay clear-headed. That look at the data. Do most of the players actually use this feature? Or is it that the ones who are complaining about it, do you see them in the numbers?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting one, because sometimes you get the most noisy players and they will be kind of shouting about something, and yet behind the thing that they're shouting about is a real problem. And I think the trick, the difficulty is making sure that the team are listening properly to what they're meaning, not necessarily what they're saying.
Yes.
And it's to be honest, I think it's one of those sort of you know it when you hear it moments.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and it's that's why you should share your experiences with other community managers from other companies, because it's invaluable. I mean, if you lose that info and you don't have the opportunity to vent to someone who actually understands what you do for a living, and maybe they managed to solve this.
Yeah,
they had the same issue a year ago, or then you figure it out together. I mean, that's at least for me, I couldn't do my job without the community of other community managers here.
Yeah,
and it's sort of also we can test things within our community. Like, what do you think of that?
That's an interesting thing there, because I think that sort of resonates generally for me, which is, the openness that you talked about earlier on, the transparency. I think that's a really key part of what you're saying here as well. It's not just transparency to the players and internally, it's actually transparency between us and other people, because our community needs and wants aren't that different from other people's, but they aren't the same either. There are parallels, there are sort of elements that are consistent, but we can learn from each other much more effectively if we spend time talking.
Yes, and also you can build trust that way. And maybe it's I think especially here in Finland, we've sort of, it's the cornerstone of the success of the industry here.
Yeah. I totally agree.
Secrets.
One last quick question for you, again from that anonymous guy. Are there any recommended third-party tools we can integrate with our game for community managers?
I think Discord has the best plugins and extensions that you can have, and you can use so that you don't have to do everything manually. This is also something that I asked my colleagues from other companies, like what tools, and they all said that they prefer Discord. But since my users at Pocket Hunt, they are not gamers, they are industry people, So for me, Discord is not the right tool since they don't use it. But in this case, I would say there are plenty of amazing tools, and most of them you can integrate nowadays with your systems, the system that the company uses. So that's pretty cool, and I think that's one of the biggest changes in tools in the last couple of years. Made my job so much easier.
No, I totally get it. I think there's all sorts of different tools. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but there's a few new companies that are doing a lot of work around.
Yeah, I think there are a few interesting startups also working on this. So you just have to figure out what your issue is, what your needs are, and then just Google. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I was talking to an Israeli team the other day who are doing a whole bunch of work around machine learning, so they can track key phrases and sentiment analysis, but also they look for obvious disparities. So, for example, they were showing me how the machine learning could identify grooming language.
Yes,
which
and
is like
identify the mood.
Yeah,
and not just keywords, like, and the tone.
The tone, exactly. Yes. You know, the language tone. I mean, there was a you know, quite a kind of shocking example that they gave. But the point for me is like, it doesn't matter what the tool is, as long as you understand how you're going to use it and employ it properly. Yeah. But really thinking
your needs very, like, it has to be very concrete.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, thank you so much for that. That's been great. And again, I think, you know, again, thank you so much for dropping in at the last minute. You're perfect. It's exactly what we needed. I think focusing on community management, focusing on your team, and delivering an authentic experience is absolutely what it's all about.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Emilia.